Welcome back to My Life Banner's Grief and PTSD Forum. Again, so glad that you're here. Remember, no matter what's going on, no matter what's facing you in life today, your life matters both to God and to us. In this session, we'll talk about the sources of grief, and we'll also talk about secondary losses. We often think about grief when it comes to losing a loved one, but there are lots of things in life that can occur that can cause grief. Those can be secondary losses, sometimes compounding our grief. What do we do with that? We'll share a little bit about that in this session. As always, after the segment, if you'd like, leave us your comments, tell us what you're thinking. God bless. Let's get into the session. It's interesting when you talk about, the expectations of people. I remember when I lost my dad, and I began to look at Scripture and if I just change my mindset, all through Scripture, there are all these places of grief. And there are all these, God's near to the brokenhearted, and He's acquainted with grief. So it's there. And if you look at all these situations, there's plenty of situations, like you talk about combat, you talk about loss. There are all these things in there. So just as much as there is Scripture telling us about joy and rejoicing and coming through it, there are also a lot of verses in there. And that kind of opened my heart up to this whole conversation about grief. Let me ask this. You said something, two things that Joseph said. You said it's not always just death. I want to address that. What are some other areas where people grieve? What are some other sources of grief?
The definition pretty much of grief is that it's because of loss. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we assume that anytime you're grieving, it's because of a loss or because of death of an individual, but actually, grief is more so a loss of anything that you lose. And so, if you can lose your job and grieve the loss of your income, okay, and a lot of times in addictions, and when we're dealing with addictions clients, what I talk to them about is that they have to grieve their lifestyle. They have to grieve the loss of the substance who have been their friend for so long that helped them to cope with life. Because you have to think about it. This has become the part of their lifestyle. It's become part of them. It has become part of what they went to in order to deal with life and try to deal with life on life terms, which they could not. So now you take that substance or you take that thing from them. Now, the first thing they're going to do is go into denial, anger, depression. They have to bargain with it. So they have to go through the stages of grief. So a lot of times is that when that person loses something that they have been connected with on a daily basis, they feel an absence of that substance, that thing, or that person. So grief can be more than just a person, but it can be a situation, So that in itself would cause anybody to experience grief, and they might not even realize it. I have known people who go into depression when they lose a job after being at a job for 20 years. And they just can't, they say, this is part of my daily life, my function. I just can't function without this. So you see that process. First they go through denial, and then they go into anger, and then they start moving into depression. So it has a lot to do with loss, and sometimes it's loss of lifestyle.
Another thing, I think, that when you think about grief and the loss of something, I think about marriages, right? When you get a divorce, you can grieve have a grieving process through that divorce, because when you think about it, when you become married, the idea is to what? Become one, right? And so I have a sibling who's experiencing divorce, and she was kind of like, man, I'm really angry at this dude, right? But why is it still so painful? Right, because when you become one with somebody, and now you're at a point where you're literally, over the years, you fused your lives together, you fused your love and your relationship together, and now you're literally ripping it apart, right? And so not only is it painful, sometimes it can be painful physically, emotionally, mentally, right? You can be exhausted, because marriage is one thing where when you come together and then one day you say, this is not working, and you grieving through that as well. So that's another area outside of the death of a loved one or death of someone that you know, or even the death of a pet for children. Children experience grief through that process as well. Marriage is one where you're literally ripping apart from someone that you fuse your life with. And so that's an area where you can grieve as well.
Okay, I have something from the audience. You want to just raise her hand, so come on. You will in just a second. Okay. I wanted to add, go ahead.
May I add to to the conversation. Also, there are the secondary losses. And so, in my experience, I lost a spouse. So, that was a very significant relationship. So, everything that maybe a person that has experienced a divorce, I'm grieving the loss of the actual person, all of this ripping and separating because that person that I was connected to and intertwined with is no longer a part of my life. My body literally recalls and remembers, like this a person is supposed to be here right now. And so it is actually a process of you resetting yourself, getting to know yourself all over again, and literally like creating new brain pathways that now we live life differently because this other person that was so intricately connected and wounded in your life no longer it doesn't no longer exist. And then the secondary losses, the finances change, whatever it was that that person used to do in your life, that role that they fulfilled, that there's a void there. And so then now what fills this void? And so you may have positive or have positive coping skills of how you're going to deal with all of these secondary losses in this grief process, or a person may go and have more negative responses to the grief. Do you just go numb, or do you actually take the time to kind of process through all of those different secondary losses and what that actually means for your life? And then how do you rebuild? How do you restart over? How do you even find the energy to start over and do all the things that you have to do to kind of rebuild?
Before we move on, I want to jump on that just for a little bit. Another loss that I've run into that people don't often think of, when people are getting older or when they've had a sickness that takes away some of their mobility, takes away some of their independence. There can often be measures of grief in that. And you may run into someone and you don't know why they are having a hard time. But often there is a grieving process, just like when you lose your job, you lose your position, and you're grieving that loss of where you were and what you used to be able to do. So I just want to emphasize that, because some of you that are sitting here may not even realize, or you may realize it, but you're not quite sure, well, what's going on with me? Thanks so much for joining us today. If you'd like to connect with us, you can do so at ChristyMinger.com, or you can catch us across social media at the addresses listed below. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment. God bless and have a wonderful day.